Well, welcome everyone. My name is Katie Parker. I work as a local foods and small farms educator with the University of Illinois Extension. And so today I'm going to be talking about some unique plants for the holidays. And the plant that I'm going to cover is Plumeria. So Plumerias are beautiful, colorful flowering plants that produce numerous flowers with fragrant scents. These flowers are commonly recognized for being in Hawaiian leis. One common name that they can be referred to as well as Plumeria is frangipani. So that's another name that they can be referred to as well. So they are part of the Apocynaceae or the dogbane family, which we often associate dogbane or milkweed with. And of that family, they commonly produce a milky sap, but they're also known for being a family of flowering plants, which can include trees, shrubs, herbs, and many other plants. Most of the species of Plumeria are deciduous trees or shrubs, and the species are native to Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean. Oftentimes will be seen growing as far north as Florida, but we can see them grown in more ornamental or grown as ornamentals in warmer regions as well. In warm climates, Plumeria are grown as landscape plants, and they can get anywhere up to 30 feet tall. Whereas in cold areas like here in Illinois, they're best grown in containers, which we move outside during warm weather and then back inside during our cooler fall and winter temperatures. So typically once we get to temperatures around 40 degrees Fahrenheit at night, it's best to bring those plants back inside. So they grow best in USDA hardiness zones 10B to 11. So this is a picture. My boyfriend's parents actually live in southern Florida. And so this is a Plumeria in their backyard. I took a picture of it because I thought the flowers were pretty. I never thought I would be giving a presentation on Plumeria, but that's just one of the joys of being an extension. An alternative, so we just saw the plant, the Plumeria growing in the ground in Florida, but here in Illinois, we're going to be growing that as a container plant, which you can see here. We commonly see them grown in pots, so that way we can move them in during the winter. They need well-drained soil that doesn't dry out and that doesn't remain soggy. A cactus mix that can be found at the store works for this, or you can also use regular potting soil and just add perlite to that mix. Plumeria need bright sun, warm temperatures, and appropriate moisture to thrive. The more light that the plant receives, the more water it needs. So during the summer days, we can expect that we'll be watering the plant much more than we would be during the winter. Overwatering can cause issues with root rot and plant death. So you want to make sure that we're allowing the soil to dry out between waterings. Plumerias, as we had already mentioned, are best for those zones 10B to 11, which is oftentimes southern Florida and parts of southern California. These plants are susceptible to cold damage, but thanks to their weed-like vigor, some level of regeneration is possible with these plants if it hasn't been completely killed. It's best to bring the potted plants in, as I had mentioned previously, when our nighttime temperatures become less than 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And then as for fertilization, it's best done during the growing season, and we will often fertilize with phosphorus to encourage flowering. So Ken is our unique plant owner. So Ken moved to Illinois from Florida probably quite a while ago, right, Ken? This is one of his plants that he has here. And so this was a cutting that he had taken from some of his larger plants. These are some additional plants of Ken. So you can see here in Illinois that we can grow some pretty sizable plants. So these ones here are about 10 years old. And so they've gotten a pretty good size. If you look closely too, you can see some of the pink flowers. So they do flower here in Illinois as well. And then the plant that we saw on the last slide, Ken had mentioned that it is a cutting from this plant here. And so later we'll talk about some ways that you can start your own Plumeria plant. Some of the issues that we can see with our Plumeria plants is if you notice bugs on the leaves, they're likely spider mites, whiteflies, or mealybugs. Leaves infested with these bugs will likely wilt, droop, or turn green or yellow gold. The best way to notice these or to identify these is to start examining the top and bottom of the leaves looking for pests. If it's necessary, we can use insecticidal soaps to help to control the pest. As for diseases, plumerias are not generally affected by many diseases, but some that we can see is rust, which we'll notice as yellow, orange, or reddish brown powdery pustules on the leaves, stems, or buds of the plant. Here you can see rust in the background picture. Some things that we can do to control this or stop the spread is it's best to collect and remove the diseased leaves. So we can put those diseased leaves in a trash bag or somewhere where the spores won't be spread. If needed, mild outbreaks can be controlled by fungicides, but that is not something that we commonly see a need for. Some other diseases that can affect plumeria include black tip fungus, stem rot, and then frangipani mosaic virus, which those we don't see often in contaminated grown plants in Illinois. So one thing that's most attractive about plumeria plants is their flowers. So their flowers include colors of pink, red, white, yellow, or other pastel bicolors. The flowers are very fragrant with a scent of jasmine, citrus, and gardenia. They are pollinated by night-flying stink moths, so the flowers will really begin to release their fragrance in the evening, but they do have a nice floral scent at other times of the day as well. As I had mentioned previously, the flowers are commonly used for making leis on many Pacific islands. The number of flowers per cluster does vary, and some cultivars produce more flowers, whereas some can produce less. The percentage of branch tips that will set flowers also varies considerably from 10 to 60%, with compact plants generally blooming more heavily than our leggy plants. So pruning can be an important part with flowering as well. And then as mentioned previously, so we have our plant propagation. We can easily start these plants from current plants, or if you have friends with plumeria plants, you can take a cutting from them, or you can also buy cut stems online. If that's something that you're interested in doing, you do want to make sure that you're cutting about 12 to 18 inches of leafless stem tips. It's best done in the spring, and you should allow those tips to dry out before planting. If you're going to start a new plant by cuttings, it'll likely take 1 to 3 years for it to bloom, whereas we can start them from seed as well. And with that method, it takes anywhere from 3 or more years to get our first blooms. So that is all I have for plumeria. Up next, Andrew Holsinger is going to tell us a bit about growing citrus.
All right. Well, I'm Andrew Holsinger, and I'll be talking to you today about citrus. The citrus plants, they can be grown indoors throughout the winter time. This can make an unusual gift plant, and so you won't be starting these from seed, but you can utilize a grafted plant that will maintain a smaller size. So in growing your citrus, you can start small. The seeded kind also produce thorns, so that's also a negative aspect of those, but typically we can have a dwarf sized plant that's maintainable inside the home. And it would take a longer time if you grew them from seed for them to produce fruit, and they don't come true from seed, so you wouldn't know particularly what you were getting. So when we have grafted plants, we have a rootstock, and then the scion wood is grafted on top of that rootstock, and that can help control for the size. When it comes for growing citrus, your lemon and limes are easier to grow. more of your sour citrus are more conducive to be growing indoors than your sweet fruits like oranges. When you're growing citrus plants, you'll want to find a slightly acidic potting medium. Could be that cacti mix. The citrus plants, they don't want to be overly wet, so you do need good drainage. Most of the time you might find them in a terracotta pot, but they can grow in plastic or other pots as long as you have good drainage. You want to avoid those particular potting mixes that may have enhanced moisture retention, any of those additives that would tend to retain moisture. Try to avoid those. When growing these, they do need bright light from a window. When growing indoors, typically in the outside, growing a full sun, maybe a little bit of shade whenever growing outside, but you will have to check the amount of moisture during the summer that the plants receive. Typically, they like to dry out to some extent to maybe the first 2 or 3 inches and then have a consistent amount of moisture. So these typically are grown between the range of 55 to 85 degrees Fahrenheit, and especially during the winter months when they are indoors, look for a high humidity. So adding a humidifier or vaporizer can be a great benefit. Also, the possibility of misting the leaves, and sometimes some nutrients as far as a fertilizer could be added to your misting and help to grow the plants. So when should you pick your particular citrus fruit? Well, they won't ripen after they're picked, and so you want to generally pick them whenever they have a little bit of give to the skin to where they become softer. If you miswater your particular citrus plant, it may uh, have problems when overwatered or underwatered with either shedding the flowers or shedding the fruit. So you need to be careful of the culture of these plants. The fruit are divided on the inside part of the fruit, and they do have that rind that gives it the characteristic of the hesperidium. Typically 6 to 9 months for the lemons or limes to produce, and oranges could take up to a year. So color really is a poor indicator of maturity. Again, that soft texture is going to help you to choose when to pick. And they are generally self-fertile in that you don't need very many plants in order to produce a crop. Here are listed some reliable citrus for Illinois. These are the ones that are going to bloom and fruit reliably indoors. And so they do have a bloom that does have a nice fragrance. We have Meyer lemon, ponderosa lemon, otidy orange, Persian lime or bear's lime, it's also known as, Kelmondan orange or kumquats. So any of these would be a good selection, for Illinois. The Meyer lemon, we'll discuss that in the next slide. But your ponderosa lemon is a small thorny tree. It has a fairly large fruit, and it's can be a substitute for lemon. The next is a lemon tangerine cross, and so the taste is often compared to the sweet lime. Your bear's lime also is known as the Tahitian lime and Persian lime. It's a thornless tree that produces bigger fruit than the Mexican limes. The Kelmondan orange, this is a small evergreen tree or shrub. It's believed to be a cross between the mandarin orange and the kumquat, and it does produce a small bitter tasting orange, nearly a year-round producing plant once they begin blooming. And last but not least, the kumquats. These are small, elongate, tart fruits that are good for a marmalade. The Meyer lemon was one of the most popular dwarf fruit trees. It's a lemon orange hybrid that was brought from China in 1908. And unfortunately, it had a virus that had some devastating effects to the citrus industry. So they tried to rogue out as many plants as they could during that time frame of the 1940s, 1950s. But a virus-free selection was found, and so they named that the Meyer Improved. And so it was named after Frank Meyer, who was the one that brought this particular plant to the industry. It does have an attractive dark green foliage, and it is typically found with these fragrant white flowers as we find in the photograph. It is susceptible to a few pests. You may have anthracnose, scab, sooty mold, canker, or gummosis. And there's some potentials for a few insects of aphids, thrips, cutworms, leaf rollers, mealybugs, scales, or whiteflies. But be sure to watch out for mites. Others, as far as citrus to consider in Illinois, we have the fingered citron that we see in this photograph. And so that's also referred to as Buddha's hand. Tangerine or Samatsa orange. It's a sweet seedless fruit. And so they're not really oranges, but they are of the tangerine. The limequat is a Mexican lime and kumquat hybrid. The kaffir lime is grown for the leaves, used in some of your Thai or Southeast Asian dishes. Has a small bumpy fruit. Citron is a popular type of orange. The Eureka lemon is a thornless cultivar, and it has a striped fruit. And then we have a navel orange. And so this is a small tree with slender spines growing in the leaf axils. Your care for your citrus, again, full sun to partial shade when growing them outdoors. A bright light. You'll probably need to supplement your light in your home for your citrus plants. Consistently drained soil. Here we can see they're also grown in a pot situation when outdoors, so you can take those pots out of the ground, and that might help moderate some of the moisture. You can see that the ground has been mulched to preserve some of that moisture. So you're only going to fertilize these when they're growing in the spring to the fall, and then reduce the watering during your winter months. Pruning can be done to improve your airflow and reduce it to a smaller size. But typically with your dwarf varieties, you shouldn't have too much problems. The fruit clusters can also be pruned or pinched to provide a larger, healthier fruit. Here we see some of the bright light coming through the windows here at the Missouri Botanical Garden. And you see the terracotta pots and how they have some leaching residue. But you will want that well-drained soil in order to keep these plants growing all season long. And the cultural practices that we typically use are some specialized fertilizers because they're heavy feeders. They'll need the 2:1:1 ratio. If you find some yellowing leaves, that may indicate the need for some more fertilizer, but also including your trace minerals, iron, zinc, manganese, that may be added to keep the plants nutritionally balanced. So only fertilize these whenever they're actively growing, and using a soluble fertilizer can be a great benefit. And that's all I have for citrus.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Enroth. I'm a horticulture educator, and I am based in Macomb, Illinois. And I want to talk to you today about probably two of the things that I consume at least once a day, if it's a good day. If not, maybe more often. We're going to talk about growing coffee and tea here in our neck of the woods, where I'm at, again, Illinois. So we're going to start with coffee, and then just kind of the basic details here. We are dealing with coffee Arabica. Now, that's the scientific name, and the plant family is in the Rubiaceae family. Pictured here on the right side of the screen, this is actually a coffee plantation in the tropics right there. And something to know, as I learned about this is a tropical evergreen. We would classify it probably as a small tree. Maybe especially just the straight species, Coffee Arabica, but over the centuries of cultivation, we now might call what we would order from a catalog, if we're going to be growing this at home, as like maybe a small shrub or large shrub. If you lived in the southern parts of the US, maybe you could plant this outside, and then that could become maybe a large shrub, small tree for you. But as a crop, coffee is not grown in the lower 48 states. However, University of Florida, because of the warmer climate that it is experiencing due to climate change, has started to investigate growing coffee. And they've even looked at possibly growing it in tandem with, say, the citrus crops there. And kind of the interesting thing is the citrus, by growing it in the understory of the citrus, you might think, oh, the shade might help the coffee, but it also helps to impart some insulation. So if it does get cooler there, you do have that canopy over top that might be able to help insulate that coffee plant. However, don't expect to have Florida grown coffee at your local coffee store shop. It will probably be more of a novel type crop. It's not going to be something that's going to be probably dispersed throughout the United States here, not for a very long time. For us in Illinois, coffee is going to be grown as a container plant. We're going to move this inside right now in the fall and the winter, and then we will move it back outside in the spring and summertime. Now, there was so much to cover here when it comes to history of coffee, and oh boy, where do we start here? But we'll start where it started. Native to the southeast parts of Ethiopia and in the rainforest area, the Congo River Basin. Now, we often think, oh, coffee, that's a tropical crop. That means it likes our hot weather. Well, if you look here at the second bullet point, it's found at higher elevations in these areas. So no, it necessarily doesn't like very, very hot temperatures that we do experience here in Illinois. We'll talk about what we do about that here in a second. It was first discovered and used in the Middle East. We know at least it was before the 10th century. We at least know that much. But where it first began, brewed, is lost to time. So from Arabia, where it was there in the Middle East, taken to Java, and by the time we got to the 16th century, it went to the Caribbean, South and Central America by way of Amsterdam. It kind of traveled up north, not necessarily to be grown in Amsterdam, but then shipped over there to the other parts of the world. And then by the time we got to the 19th century, coffee is grown in India and Ceylon, all over pretty much that equatorial belt here on the planet. And pretty much it is one of the largest major horticultural crops here on the planet, grown and traded around the world. And if you want to know who has won out after all that history as a primary exporter, it is Brazil. They are the top exporter of coffee. Now let's look specifically at Arabica, because there are a couple other species we'll cover, but really focusing on Arabica because that's mostly what is in all of our ground up brews. This is the most common, has the best value in terms of what is sold out on the market. And that's because Arabica tends to have a softer and sweeter taste compared to some of the others out there. Now, if you want to know, well, what is the best coffee out there? Well, it is believed objectively that the coffee grown in Yemen is probably one of the best coffees out there. However, due to geopolitical issues in that part of the world, it seems highly unlikely that we will ever, at least in the coming decades, see Yemenis coffee come out as a worldwide distributed thing. Right now, it's very specialty. It's very expensive to get something Yemenis coffee, and so, but that's considered kind of the top out there. But we do have other kind of boutique or novel type growers and roasters that can rival some of that flavor. But there is more than just Arabica. So let's look at these three other types real quickly here. And the first one is Robusta. Now, this is coffee Canfora. So it is a separate species from coffee Arabica. This is a popular coffee bean in Europe, Middle East, and Africa. Now, this has a very strong, harsh flavor. Folks describe this as burnt and rubbery. This is actually probably what my dad drinks. He's been drinking instant coffee for, well, ever. And instant coffee has a very strong, hard flavor, lots of caffeine, extremely high caffeine levels. Now, if you're wondering about caffeine, maybe you know this, maybe you don't. This can help you at your next trivia night. Maybe caffeine is actually a natural plant defense. It's an alkaloid. And for us humans, it helps us out in the cardiac department, gets our heart beating a little fast. But it is one of those things that helps to actually a chemical defense to pest control. So Robusta has more of that. It's more resilient to pests. It's also a bit more forgiving in terms of where it can be grown, and has a bit larger suitable growing area than Arabica. And you're going to find Robusta probably in more areas like Europe, Middle East, Africa, where strong coffee is the norm. You can also, though, find it mixed into a lot of discount coffee. And as I mentioned, instant coffee products. And then we have liberica coffee. And now this is coffee liberica, grown primarily in Southeast Asia, has a very restrictive growing need. And now back in the 19th century, there was a disease called coffee rust. It wiped out Arabica production throughout the world. And liberica kind of rose to be that sole global supplier of coffee. And that was grown in the Philippines. Now, this, as you would expect, grew the Philippines economy tremendously, which at the time it was actually a colony, and it declared its independence in 1898 because they had this big thriving economy. They said, hey, we can strike out on our own. The United States did not recognize that, and then actually imposed economic sanctions and cut off supplies to the island nation there. Has pretty much led to the downfall of Liberica coffee as a global supply. And it just kind of to follow up on that story, and it is a very interesting story. World War II happened, and the U.S. was actually in the process of recognizing the Philippines' independence prior to World War II, but then that happened, which really put a hold on everything else. But finally, in 1946, the U.S. did recognize the Philippines' independence. And then we have excelsa coffee. Now, excelsa is actually a variety within Liberica coffee. Now, but for the longest time, it was considered its own separate species. But then you know what happens when botanists and geneticists get involved? They do their study and their testing and realize, oh, these are actually the same species. But then excelsa was then put as a variety underneath the former one. So excelsa, they still believe this to be a bit more of its own on its own, but it does account for a little bit of the coffee trade throughout the world here. It has various distinct differences from Liberica. It's a bit more tart, but has a lot more fruity notes. You can really give this a lot more flavor the darker you roast it or the longer that you roast it. But very often, we take excelsa and we mix it in with things like our Arabica stuff to add flavor to our own American type coffees. Now, that was an interesting background on coffee, but what if you want to grow coffee? As I mentioned, it is going to be a container plant for us here in Illinois. And so we're going to need to dedicate space for this plant outside and inside. And as you saw that coffee plantation, it is kind of an understory plant. And it doesn't necessarily tolerate our hot Illinois summers as well as you might think. And so having a shaded area on a patio or out in the yard might do well, give it some afternoon shade. If you move it indoors in the winter, you're probably also going to need supplemental lighting because we're still going to be, if you are growing this, you're going to harvest the fruit for brewing coffee, you're going to need to have some light for that fruit to develop. It does depend on your variety and what you order, but typically these can grow 15 foot tall. These can easily be controlled by pruning, which we're going to cover. And as I mentioned, it is a naturally an understory plant. And look at that preferred temperature range, 59 to 75. I know where I'm at in Illinois, I get well above 75 degrees most days in the summer months. So again, kind of emphasizing that need for giving it a nice afternoon shaded spot. One of the neat thing about coffee is that the flowers are self-fertile. So if you were walking through a coffee plantation and you saw some Arabica right there, you could grab those from there and you could plant it and it would come true from seed. Other varieties like Robusta and then some hybrids, though, those are propagated by cuttings. More than likely, you are going to be ordering your coffee plants online. Maybe you'll find them at like a local garden center as like a specialty order, or maybe they have some fun little special plants that they're selling that year. And then if, say, you plant by seed, you could possibly get berries to form in 5 to 7 years. If you buy the live plant at, say, order online or from the nursery, maybe look about 3 years until you can start harvesting berries. As we're really talking about with all of these plants here, we are talking container growing. And then we go kind of with that rule of thumb with containers, when you're potting these up, making sure to only go up slightly larger than the existing pot that it's in, maybe 1 or 2 pot sizes bigger. That way, when you go to water it, there's not all this free water hanging out in that pot, and the plant doesn't have the root system to take it up, and it just sits in all that water. So that's why we slowly pot up plants. Again, soil-free potting mix. Coffee likes slightly acidic, well-drained soil, which is basically all of our Midwestern garden plants like that. And it does tolerate some alkaline conditions. Now, coffee is a woody plant and can be pruned like in a similar way. So if you want to keep it from hitting your ceiling, you can actually clip the central leader here that you see in that photograph, and that will promote branching outward. And it's actually those branches that are going to flower and bear the fruit. Now, fruit is only, or flower, it only flowers on second year wood or last year's growth. And so if you have new growth, you're not going, don't expect any flowering to occur on that branch that year. Sometimes coffee plants can get a little bit out of control, and kind of like our other woody shrubs, we can rejuvenate cut these. And so cut them down 15 inches from the soil line, and then you can prune and train a new central leader and then new branches from there. Now, coffee is an insect pollinated plant, so we need insects if we want to get berries. And so the flowers are typically going to open up in the late springtime, early summer. They are related to gardenia, so they have a very sweet scented jasmine aroma. Honeybees do like these, and so you're going to move this outside when you see the flowering happen so that the pollinators can take advantage of this. If the coffee plant is an indoor-only resident and you still want coffee berries, you're going to have to probably simulate some type of pollination with a toothbrush or cotton swab. Now, in terms of harvesting coffee, it's usually going to take place in autumn. This is going to be after you've relocated the plant inside. The berry will produce, or the coffee will produce a berry. It'll go from green to red when it's ripe. And then you can test the ripeness by washing the berries. A good berry will sink in water. Now, there's a whole process for processing these berries, including removing the outer pulp, which is edible, by the way. You place the coffee beans in water to allow it to ferment, clean off all of that goop that's on there. Then after that, let them dry out in the sun. And once you've done that, you then have kind of a husk or a hull that you have to get off of there, either in the wind or just take them in a strainer and get all of the little debris and items off of there. And finally, you roast them. And roasting is a class in and of itself. Basically, it's what develops the flavor and aroma, and however you like your coffee is going to dictate how you roast your coffee. Now let's move on to tea. Now, some of the details here, and I think one of the neatest things about tea is that it is a camellia, Camellia sinensis, and in that very family. Just like coffee, it is a southern subtropical evergreen shrub. Again, kind of you'll find it up in the upper elevations where it's native to. In terms of hardiness for this plant, there's some conflicting information out there. I noted hardiness indicated zone 7. However, a lot of others said zone 8. And so I split the difference here and said zone 7B. Tea is actually grown as a crop in some parts of the southern U.S., though not necessarily as this, nationally distributed type product. Most of that is coming from other parts of the planet. But for us here in Illinois, it will once again be a container plant. Now, tea is, if you thought coffee had a fascinating history, tea even more so. So as the myth goes, the first use of coffee was 2737 BC. That's awfully specific. That's immediately raises a red flag by the Emperor Shennong, who was sitting underneath or next to a camellia shrub, and the leaf fell in his water, and he took a drink and he found it to be refreshing, and boom, tea was born. Now that again is a myth. A lot of Asian and Indian cultures do kind of have their own tea origin story, but that's kind of the most popular one out there. It began mostly in medicinal use. By 1618, 907 AD, it was basically spread throughout China. Europe first started drinking tea in 1606. And they just fell in love with it. Tea was more popular than beer. They were driving the beer and the winemakers out of business. And so that's why the Europeans then started taxing tea to make it a bit more competitive, I suppose. But it was still absolutely popular. However, even in those times, the tea plant and how it was processed was a carefully guarded secret by the Chinese, which created a monopoly. There is a fascinating book written. It's called All the Tea in China. It's basically how that monopoly was broken by a Scotsman, and the India Trading Company sent him in to basically dress up like he was Chinese and go in and infiltrate the tea processing facility and figure out how they did it and take those secrets over to India, who also grew tea. They just didn't process it like the Chinese did. Chinese was kind of considered that gold standard. That happened, that broke the monopoly, and then tea kind of went worldwide from there. Obviously, Revolutionary War, that's kind of where we first learned about tea in school, the British, that Boston Tea Party. But because of that shortage, American colonists had to be more creative how they made their tea. And so there were other herbal teas that started popping up and substitutes like New Jersey tea, which is a North American native plant. And that seemed to be the most familiar in terms of the flavor to the Chinese type tea plant. Again, there's many different teas out there: green tea, black tea, oolong tea, whatever you want, but there's only one species. It's all how it's processed in the industry. So the botanists in Europe, they swore that green tea was a different species than black tea. But then when the Scotsman came and he infiltrated the tea processing facility, he found out it's all the same species. It's all in how they process it. Now, there is a bit diversity here. There is a variety, the sinensis, that's considered the China type versus the variety Arabica, or the Assam type, which is more indigenous to India. Now, growing tea here in Illinois, this is not in Illinois, this picture here. This is what it looks like in full commercial production. It's pruned very low to the ground. It is grown in full sun, though if you are routinely harvesting leaves, like what they're doing here, you do have to be a bit careful because our hot Illinois sun can burn those new leaves that sprout once you pluck the older leaves. It can be pruned back and fit into a spot when you're moving it inside into the winter months. Left unpruned, it can also become a very large shrub, 15, 20 foot tall. Supplemental lighting, like coffee here, needed for those short winter days that we're experiencing right now in December. And tea leaves are sensitive to wind, which I know we definitely have here in my neck of the woods. So might want to site it in a more sheltered location. In terms of planting, just like coffee and every other plant we're talking about today, most of these are going to be live ordered or found as novelties at a local nursery. Rarely will you use seed, but it is possible to find, to sprout tea from the seed. We'll be planting these in containers. They are camellias, as we mentioned. They're going to be flowering later in the season. Again, they're not really grown for their flowers. They're grown for their leaves. The flowers, though, will arise from their leaf axil right here. They are pretty, but again, that's not quite why we're growing this. Tea is once again insect pollinated, though. I thought this was fascinating that the fruit develops over a 12-month period. That is a long time to wait for a tea seed. In terms of harvest, what you're going to be picking is actually the top 2 to 3 leaves on the tea plant and also that terminal bud that you'll be picking. And then it will sprout and branch out new leaves and you can pick those. And so you're not going to get that much. Just like coffee here, you're probably not going to be growing as much maybe to supply a daily need. It might be a once a year, twice a year, a couple times a year kind of event where you get to brew your own tea from the leaves that you've harvested. And how do you process it? Well, you ferment the leaves, which is actually a totally incorrect term. They don't actually ferment at all. Think of it more as a curing or a drying process, but ferment is a beverage industry term and it carried over to tea. With that, on to miracle fruit.
All right. Thank you, Chris. So last plant we've got is miracle fruit. And compared to some of these others we've been talking about, this is more of a novelty plant than anything else. So first off, miracle fruit, this is going to be an evergreen shrub to a small tree. Typically in the wild, they get about 18 feet tall. But in cultivation, it typically stays around 5 feet tall as a max, which is good because this is a tropical plant, so you will need to bring it indoors. So staying smaller is going to be good. It'd be kind of difficult to get a 18-foot tall plant in and outside. Typically, it's going to have an oval or pyramid shape. On this picture here, you can see this is more of a pyramid. The plant that I have is more of an oval. Looks kind of like a lollipop. Almost doesn't have much growth on the bottom of the particular plant that I have. And the cool thing about this plant, why people grow it, is that by eating the fruit, it will make sour foods taste sweet. And we'll talk about how that happens in a little bit. But first off, where does this plant come from? It is native to Africa, equatorial Africa. So those countries in red there, that is where it is native to. So again, this is a tropical plant. First described by Europeans in 1725 by Chevalier de Marquès. I didn't take French, so I don't know if I pronounced that right or not. But he was the first European to kind of describe this, and his exploring in West Africa talked about local tribes chewing on the berries before they would eat their meals, particularly when they were eating some of the cornbreads they made, or the palm wine, or some oatmeal gruel, which may not have been the best tasting food by itself, but by eating these berries, it would change, kind of enhance that flavor and make it more palatable to eat. Then in 1852, a British army surgeon and botanist talked about European travelers and traders eating this fruit and coined the term miraculous berry. So that's kind of what it was initially known as. And then over time, we've kind of shortened it to miracle berry or miracle fruit. So the fruit itself, so on the top picture there, you can see the flowers. These have small, kind of brownish whites, really kind of indistinct, nothing really spectacular to look at. Flowers about half an inch long. And a lot of times, if you've got a nice full canopy on your plant, they're kind of difficult to see sometimes. The fruit itself, they are ellipsoid or kind of oval shaped, about an inch long. When they are fully mature, they start off as dull green, and you can see that on the picture there in the middle. Start as dull green, and as they ripen, they will start to turn red. And then down the bottom there, as they continuing on that ripening process, they kind of get a darker red. And there's going to be a single seed surrounded by a pulp. And that pulp is what is going to cause sour foods to taste sweet. So inside of that fruit, inside of that pulp, there is a chemical, a glycoprotein called miraculin. And this particular compound is going to bind to the sweetness receptors on your tongue. So for humans, we've got 5 basic tastes. We have sweet, salty, bitter, sour, and umami, which is kind of the savory taste buds. So basically this miraculin is going to bind to the sweet buds on your tongue. And when it does that, in neutral pH, it will inhibit the sweetness taste. So if you're eating something that's a neutral pH or a basic pH, any sweetness on that is going to be blocked by this miraculin. But as soon as that pH in your mouth becomes acidic, the miraculin will kind of change its shape and activate that sweetness taste bud, and everything you eat is going to taste sweet. Typically, this is going to last between 30 minutes and an hour. Some people say about 2 hours. In my experience, it's been about half hour, 45 minutes. So basically what you do is you'll take that berry, you'll remove that flesh and chew that up, kind of coat the inside of your mouth and your tongue with it. And then any sour foods or acidic foods that you eat will taste sweet. So a lot of times people have often referred to as taste tripping parties. Well, you can see this picture here. We'll have a variety of different citrus. So if you were to eat a lemon after having a miracle berry, it tastes like lemonade. Beer is said to taste like a chocolate milkshake. Goat cheese is supposed to taste like cheesecake. vinegar, like apple juice, and then Tabasco sauce is reported to taste like a donut glaze. So it just kind of completely changes the taste of some of these foods because that receptor gets activated when you're eating these acidic foods. I will point out, just because you're not sensing, that sourness or that maybe that heat from like Tabasco sauce, that doesn't mean it's not going to kind of affect your body and stuff. So you don't want to go too crazy if you do this. You don't want to be drinking gallons of lemon juice here because it's gonna do a number on your innards there. So just keep that in mind if you're going to be doing something like this. But I have done lemons before, and it does taste lemonade. You can get the lemon juice, straight lemon juice, and just drink it, and it tastes like lemonade. It's interesting. You may hear about this, basically you can have sweet foods without the use of sugars, which could be important for diabetics and the obesity issues we have around the world. So why don't we use miracle fruit or this miraculin more often? Well, back in the 1960s and early to mid 70s, there was a company called Miralin that was set up by Robert Harvey. He was a biomedical student, and he kind of encountered Miracle Berry, was able to extract and that miraculin from those berries, and he started and turn that into a powdered form. And he set up this company, the Miralin Company, to basically market Miralin as basically a sugar substitute. They had plantations kind of planned to grow the fruit so they can kind of get large amounts of this. They had started market testing. They created popsicles with this miraculin coating on it so that when you would lick it, you get that coating, and then you could eat these popsicles with no sugar in them, but they would still taste sweet. They did trials with kids, and they almost unanimously picked the miraculin popsicles compared to basically the basic popsicles. They had gums, mints, desserts, tablets that you could use before you ate. They had a soft drink that came with a straw. That straw, again, the inside was coated with this miraculin powder so that when you would drink that soft drink, again, it would taste sweet without the added sugar. And this was initially marketed towards diabetics. They would send out free samples, and 85% of those people who received the free samples wanted more. So this is looking like it was going to be a wildly popular and successful food supplement here. So this company, they've been in contact with the FDA and stuff, and the FDA kind of indicated that the extract would be allowed under the classification as generally recognized as safe. However, the closer they got kind of the date when this was going to be approved and released, some mysterious events started happening. Cars started driving by their offices and taking pictures. That owner was followed home several times. At one point, the owners of the business went out to dinner, came back to the office. The office was broken into, and their FDA file was left open on a desk, like somebody had been going through it. And then shortly after all of this started happening, the FDA did not approve its use as generally recognized as safe, and it indicated it was would be listed as an additive, which would require more testing, years of testing, and millions of dollars. So because of this, the company folded, and nothing has really happened since. There's been a few companies that have, in the last several decades, that have kind of picked it up and tried to do stuff with it, but nothing's really happened with it. And that's just kind of a quick overview of that. There's a lot of news articles out there that you can find that go into more detail on some of the interesting things that happen, maybe a little not above board things that were going on with the development of this product. So when it comes to miracle fruit, how can we grow that here in Illinois? So this is going to be like a zone 10, zone 11 plants. So unless you are in probably South Florida, you're going to be growing this as a container plant, like a lot of these other plants we've been talking about. Full sun to partial shade. When I grow mine, I do mine in partial shade. They can get a little bit burned if you give them too much sun, particularly when it gets real hot out. They do like acidic, moist, well-drained soil. So typically we're going to be doing a pH about 4.5 to 6 is what they like. So something like a 50-50 mix of peat, moss, and perlite is a good mix for these. Some people will do a peat and pine bark mix, again, 50-50. They do like humid conditions. So in the summer here in Illinois, that's typically not going to be an issue. But when you bring them indoors, that may be like you would do with other house plants, cluster them together to help increase that humidity, put them on a saucer with rocks in it, fill that with water to increase that humidity, run a humidifier, things like that. Heard of people putting clear garbage bags over them, again, to increase that humidity. With that, though, you don't get as much airflow, so disease issues could pop up if you go that route. So you want to make sure you take that bag off occasionally, get some air movement in there. They can be sensitive to high salt levels, so you don't want to go too crazy with fertilization. And a lot of times you want to use a kind of a more acidic type fertilizer like meracid or something like that. And they can also be sensitive to chlorine. So depending on know where you're getting your water from. If it's got chlorine in it, either you'll want to use some kind of bottled water or let the water sit out for a day or two so that chlorine can gas off. And some of our house plants, you can get some scorching brown around the margins of the leaves if you've got a lot of chlorine in that soil from watering. Like I mentioned, it is zone 10, so you want to bring this indoors during the winter. When I bring mine in, I'm typically doing it with my other house plants when the lows start getting into the mid 50s or so is when I start bringing my plants in, so I don't get any damage. I did see some reports that it can tolerate a light frost, but I personally would not risk doing that. I bring it in before we get anywhere near getting a frost. These plants are self-pollinating, so you don't need to have insects. They will kind of flower year round. The plants I have are flowering right now, so I'll just go through, shake the plants, run my hand through there, so they'll release some of their pollen. As far as pests and diseases go, really not too many pest issues outside of kind of your typical houseplant pests, so mealybugs, spider mites, things like that. If you get too much water in them, the soils are waterlogged, you can get some root rot issues. So again, making sure that's well drained. You've got drainage holes in your pots. If you have them in a saucer, make sure you're emptying that water from the saucer so it's not sitting in that water as well. And they can be prone to drying out. You can get some damage to the plants as well. So a little bit of a Goldilocks zone there, making sure it's not too dry and not too wet, but a fairly easy plant to grow. Again, kind of more of a curiosity than anything else. So with that is the end of our unique plants for today. For those of you that are not familiar with kind of all of our good growing stuff, we do also have a blog and a podcast that we do weekly. So you can check those out by using these links or those QR codes there. And with that, we can take some questions. We do have an evaluation. If you would fill that out, let us know how we did, what worked, what didn't work. Any ideas for future presentations? Again, you can go to that, take a picture of that QR code if you have a cell phone. You can do that, or check out that link, go.illinois.edu/ggunique.